Every mortal fears this man. To know him invites terror, yet none can resist his strange power. Dracula, denied human love, he thirsts for human blood, and his kiss is fatal. Jack Palance is Dracula, a world premiere this week on the CBS Friday Night Movies. Dracula.
Roll out.
Somebody here call a cab?
Go! Go!
The story of two men who destroyed more trucks than anyone else in World War II.
Friday on CBS.
In the KNXT newsroom, Israeli commandos have struck the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal. And the question in Washington, who's next for the number 2 job?
Watch Joseph Benty on Newsroom at 11.
It may come as a surprise, but these are the kinds of things you can get at a Ralph's Bakery. They've got award-winning cakes, and they're frozen pastries, flaky crust pies, too. And they've really got all kinds of great breads. Did you know Ralph's has its own bakery to make sure you get the kind of quality you want, but also to keep the prices as low as possible? A super bakery in a supermarket. It's a good thing there's a Ralph's.
Oh, I use my Security Pacific MasterCard card for almost everything. Auto repairs, take out my wife to dinner, gasoline. In fact, my 6 grandchildren are here with me today. We bought them some clothes for school. Pants for Stacy, Joy a shirt, Yvonne a beautiful dress. Something special for everyone.
Something special. Special services for special people. You've got something special at Security Pacific Bank.
This is a CBS News special report. The Vice President resigns. Here is correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Vice President Agnew, burying himself as a tax cheat, resigned today under an agreement which protects him from prosecution on charges of grafting. And a federal prosecutor brought in from Chicago especially to deal with the Agnew case said, "I have never seen a stronger case of bribery or extortion." A Justice Department statement submitted to federal court in Baltimore as Agnew pleaded no contest to evading taxes in 1967 detailed in 40 pages evidence of, quote, a pattern of substantial cash payments to Agnew. They began, it is alleged, in Agnew's first political post, chief executive of Baltimore County, and continued through his tenure as governor of Maryland and his first term as vice president. For the tax evasion, Agnew was fined $10,000 and put on probation for 3 years. The resignation, only the second by a vice president in the nation's history, and the first was under very different circumstances, presents a new problem for President Nixon, himself not yet out of the cloud of Watergate. Mr. Nixon has asked the Republican hierarchy to propose possible successors by tomorrow evening. His choice, and many names are being mentioned tonight, will have to be approved by majority vote of each House of Congress. Our correspondents have more details on the various aspects of this historic story. Let's hear first from Robert Shackney in Baltimore.
The Attorney General of the United States normally doesn't go to court to direct a prosecution, but a criminal defendant isn't normally the Vice President of the United States. Nor do carloads of Secret Service agents normally circle a federal courthouse during a criminal proceeding. But they did in Baltimore today, and that too was a hint that climactic events were taking place. Inside the courthouse, extraordinary security measures. Marshals guarding the temporary chambers of Judge Walter Hoffman. Other marshals guarding the entrance to courtroom number 3. And then, just before 2 o'clock, with no advance public warning, Spiro Agnew walked into the jammed courtroom. You could almost feel a collective taking in of breath, a kind of subdued gasp on the part of assembled newsmen, lawyers, and officials. It was a court proceeding of high formality and ceremony. Agnew and his 3 lawyers on one side. On the other, the Attorney General, his assistant in charge of the criminal division, the Baltimore prosecutor and his whole staff, government legal experts, clerks, and secretaries. Judge Walter Hoffman made it clear quickly what the proceedings were about. First, a question. Did Agnew fully understand his rights? "I do, Your Honor," said the Vice President. Then the charge, evasion of income taxes for the year 1967. How did Agnew plead? "We plead nolo contendere," said Agnew's lawyer, "no contest." The judge. I am required to advise you that nolo contendere is a legal equivalent to a plea of guilty. Do you thoroughly understand? Agnew, I do, Your Honor. Then a series of questions about Agnew's rights. Did Agnew fully understand the nature and seriousness of the charge? Also that he might be subject to imprisonment. Each time Agnew replied, yes, he understood. It quickly became clear that there was an agreement between Agnew and the Justice Department, an understanding, something in exchange for government leniency and reduced charges. I advise the court, said Agnew lawyer J. Topkis, that a letter subscribed by the Vice President has been transmitted in which he resigns his office. Next, it was Attorney General Richardson's turn. An integral part of the agreement, he told the judge, was full disclosure of the case against Agnew. There was evidence, he said, of a pattern of substantial cash payments to the defendant during the period when he served as governor of Maryland in return for engineering contracts with the state of Maryland. That evidence was to be made part of the court record. However, Richardson went on, the government would not press charges of bribery and corruption. To have done this, Richardson said, would have meant months and years of court or congressional proceedings. It is unthinkable, said the Attorney General, that this nation should have been required to endure the anguish and uncertainty of a prolonged period in which the man next in line of succession to the presidency was fighting the charges brought against him by his own government. Finally, said Richardson, he was recommending leniency, no prison term, that Agnew, by resigning and pleading, had been punished enough. When it was Agnew's turn to speak, it turned out to be a statement that didn't quite admit but didn't quite deny guilt. With one exception, said Agnew, I deny the assertions of illegal acts on my part. The exception. I admit that I did receive payments during the year 1967 which were not expended for political purposes. I further acknowledge that contracts were awarded by state agencies in 1967 and other years to those who made such payments and that I was aware of such awards. I deny that the payments in any way influenced my official actions. I further assert that my acceptance of contributions was part of a long-established pattern of political fundraising in the state. At no time have I enriched myself at the expense of the public trust. The final act in the courtroom drama, imposition of sentence. The normal penalty, said Judge Hoffman, a 2 to 5 month prison term. However, the judge went on, I am persuaded that the national interests in the present case are so great and compelling that the ends of justice would be better served by making an exception to the general rule. I therefore approve the plea agreement. The sentence, the judge said, no prison term, 3 years probation, a $10,000 fine. As he left the court, the former vice president was publicly still maintaining innocence of any criminal activity. He said he acted as he did for personal reasons and for the national interest.
Gentlemen, I believe you've all received copies of the prepared statement that I read to the court in open court. As I said in that statement, the reason that I have changed my decision to fight this matter is because that I believe it would be against the national interest, have a brutalizing effect on my family to go through a long 2-year struggle concerning this matter. You also may be aware of what I said in open court, that I categorically and flatly deny the assertions that have been made by the prosecutors with regard to their contentions of bribery and extortion on my part. You might also be aware that irrespective of the statements that were made by the Attorney General in open court, that the principal witnesses of the government are not being fully prosecuted in this matter, but are receiving either full or limited forms of immunity in exchange for their testimony against me. I will have nothing more to say at this point. I will make an address to the nation within a few days.
The criminal case against Spiro Agnew had now been brought to an end. Robert Shackney, CBS News, Baltimore.
The White House says Agnew told President Nixon of his impending resignation in a face-to-face meeting last night. The president acknowledged it publicly today with, quote, a great sense of personal loss. Then the focus quickly shifted to the search for a successor. Dan Rather has that story.
The president is making every effort not to appear hurried, and he's trying to give the impression that he had not already made up his mind about a successor before Mr. Agnew resigned. He wants the world to know that he is listening to all suggestions, that he is making his decision at a careful, measured pace. Throughout the afternoon and on into the evening, the President consulted with a variety of party and governmental leaders. These included Speaker of the House Carl Albert and Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. As flotillas of limousines cruised in and out, reporters noticed that the car carrying Speaker Albert had his new Secret Service protection right behind. Protection dictated by the fact that Albert, for the moment, is next in line of presidential succession. One reason the President is taking his time and consulting with so many people is to counter what he believes to be unfair speculation that he, Mr. Nixon, worked secretly to force Mr. Agnew out and has been planning his replacement for some time. Top White House sources and the President himself insist that this simply is not true. It's no secret that John Connally and Nelson Rockefeller, to name just two, are held in especially high esteem by Mr. Nixon, nor is it any secret that Melvin Laird would like to believe that he is vice presidential timber. But presidential aides tonight emphasize the field is wide open. The only guidance given to reporters is that Mr. Nixon does not want his nominee to be considered a caretaker vice president. We're told that what this means is that the President doesn't necessarily believe his nominee should be the Republican presidential candidate in 1976, but he does want his nominee to be of such age and experience that he could be considered a potential candidate for 76. If Congress will agree, that's what the President wants. Dan Rather, CBS News, the White House.
Under the 25th Amendment, the Presidential Succession Amendment ratified in 1967, House Speaker Albert, a Democrat, does temporarily succeed Agnew, as Dan pointed out. But the 25th also sets up the procedure for President Nixon to name a new vice president with congressional approval, of course. And that's a big subject on Capitol Hill tonight, as Bruce Morton points out.
Republican leader Hugh Scott came back from the White House this evening and told first GOP senators and then reporters that Mr. Nixon wants his new nominee to be someone who generally shares his views, who agrees with his foreign policy, and who can be confirmed. Scott said Mr. Nixon is asking for suggestions from Republican senators, congressmen, governors, and members of the National Committee. Each can submit up to 3 names of people he thinks should get the job or people who shouldn't. Scott said that he'd collect all the suggestions from senators by tomorrow afternoon and hand them in sealed envelopes to Rosemary Woods, the president's secretary. House Leader Gerald Ford will handle congressional suggestions, Scott said. National Chairman George Bush, those from the committee. And White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig is contacting governors. Despite all those lists, Scott said he doesn't expect there will be any undue delay. Democratic senators, meanwhile, are debating what kind of nominee they'd like. Do they want a caretaker, nonpartisan type, no threat to keep the White House Republican in 1976? Or simply the strongest man, whether he turns into a Republican next president or not? Not surprisingly, the Democrats disagree about it.
I'm hopeful that the president will send to the Congress a nomination that is relatively nonpartisan, a person that will not be a candidate in 1976, and someone around whom we can rally. I have a feeling that the public does not want a bitter struggle here in the Congress over the nomination of a new vice president.
You think Democrats in Congress should seek a pledge from anyone the president should nominate that he would not be a candidate in 1976?
Yes, I think so. I think that's a reasonable request. I think it's a reasonable request that in light of all that's happened, the incredible amount of trouble and difficulty that we've gone through here, and that these offices of the president and the vice presidency are going through, I think it is fair to suggest and to request that the nominee be someone that is not going to be in political contention.
A number of Democrats have said today that they would not vote for anyone for vice president who would be a candidate for president in 1976. Would that be your position?
Well, no, it wouldn't. I'd hope that the president would send a strong nominee to the Congress, the Senate of the United States. I think at this time of real national tragedy and constitutional crisis, the American people expect that the person that will be sent by the president to be a figure that can win the confidence and support of all the people. And I'd be opposed to just a any pledge or indication that the person might not to consider continued service to the country.
Do you think then on the...
Well, I think the important question is having someone who is equipped to assume the important responsibilities of the presidency. I think we've seen in recent times of tragedy where the vice president has succeeded to the presidency, and I think particularly at this difficult time of uncertainty, that it's extremely important that we have a nominee who can win the confidence of all the American people. And I'm hopeful that the president will send such a nominee, whether he be a Republican or independent or Democrat.
We ought to go about the process of selecting him. And that means both the president and the Congress under the Constitution in a way that impresses the country with the fact that we are selecting a potential president of the United States. I think the country needs that kind of reassurance.
Your colleague, Senator, have flatly objected to anybody who's given any signs that they want the office of president. Now, isn't it in a way a qualification of the vice president to want to be president?
Well, I can think of a man, for instance, who would fit the bill, who I don't think would ever seek election to the office. That's Mike Mansfield. There's a man who has the capacity for unifying, a man who might fill the bill of meeting the possibly differing requirements of a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, and a man who, as far as I know, has never evidenced any personal ambition to seek the office. And there may be others that might occur to us if we considered it. So you don't have to pick a controversial figure or a real possible future candidate to get a man of presidential caliber.
Do you feel, Senator, that Congress should endorse whoever the president chooses?
Not necessarily, because after all, the Congress has a responsibility. Even though the president has the right to propose, the Congress, in this instance, the whole Congress, would have the right to make a final determination.
Senate and House leaders agree there will be public hearings on the new nominee, forms still to be worked out. And it's also clear that the Senate doesn't think of this as something like a cabinet appointment where the president usually gets whomever he wants. They think of this as something closer to naming a Supreme Court justice, when the Senate gets serious about its right to advise and consent. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
For the next few days, perhaps weeks, Carl Albert is, as the cliche goes, a heartbeat away from the presidency. As Speaker of the House, Albert, 65, is presidential successor until a new vice president is nominated and, as we said, confirmed by Congress. Albert first learned of the resignation from aides, and about an hour after that, he began receiving Secret Service protection. Albert, an Oklahoma Democrat, has been in Congress since 1947. In 1954, Sam Rayburn named him Democratic whip, and in 1971, he was voted House Speaker. When the 93rd Congress convened in January of this year, Albert said the president had failed to produce sufficient leadership and said Congress would fill the void. He's often accused Mr. Nixon of trying to take over Congress's legislative role. Albert was educated in his home state, but then went on to be a Rhodes Scholar. He's the father of 2 children, a son and daughter. A man of large accomplishments, Carl Albert is only 5 feet 4 inches tall.
Every maker of console color TV stands behind his set with a service guarantee for up to 1 year. But after that, if something goes wrong, you pay. We think Philco solid-state color consoles are engineered better than anybody else's, so Philco stands behind them twice as long. For 2 years after delivery, we'll fix anything that's our fault. No charge for parts or labor, no fine print. Philco Ford. We think we engineer them better, so we guarantee them better.
Do you do this with your dentures, too? To get them clean, you soak them. To get them tasting fresh, you brush them with toothpaste. Well, now there's something that does both at once. New Dividend. It's a denture cleanser and a freshener, too. New Minty Dividend has special stain removers. Brush, and in no time, your dentures are clean and back in your mouth. And they taste, really fresh, too. New Dividend denture cleanser and, freshener.
It is not too hyperbolic to say that the news of Agnew's resignation and court plea hit like a thunderbolt. That, in part, resulted from the determined fighting attitude the vice president had displayed since early August, when it first became known he was under investigation.
I'm denying them outright, and I'm labeling them, and I think a person in my position at a time like this might be permitted this departure from normal language as damned lies.
Have you ever considered stepping down even temporarily until the matter is cleared up?
I have not. I will fight to prove my innocence, and that I intend to remain in the high office to which I have been twice elected.
White House says that you and the president have discussed the possibility of your resigning, that he didn't encourage you or discourage you. Can you tell us about that discussion, how it came up and why?
The president and I have not discussed that possibility, as I think he said on several occasions, and I've also said, and I want to make very clear, I'm not thinking about resigning. I want to say at this point, clearly and unequivocally, I am innocent of the charges against me. The conduct of high individuals in the Department of Justice, particularly the conduct of the chief of the Criminal Investigation Division of that department, is unprofessional and malicious and outrageous if I am to believe what has been printed in the news magazines and said on the television networks of this country, and I have had no denial that that is the case. Because of these tactics which have been employed against me, because small and fearful men have been frightened into furnishing evidence against me, they have perjured themselves in many cases, it's my understanding. I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted.
In spite of those denials, during the 9 weeks the matter has been publicly known, the government already had built much of its case against Agnew. In fact, many of the allegations must have been known during the first 8 months of the year, before he was notified that he was a target of the federal grand jury. Again, we hear from Robert Shackney, a film report he prepared before today's dramatic conclusion of the case.
From his earliest days in local politics as zoning official and then as county executive of Baltimore County, Spiro Agnew learned and accepted the political reality of the suburbs, that land developers, builders, contractors, architects, and engineers could and would finance political campaigns, his own included. And in the years of great suburban growth, these were the same builders, engineers, and architects who won multi-million-dollar government contracts for bridges, highways, sewer systems, and government buildings, and who won zoning decisions for immensely profitable new subdivisions and industrial parks. To get all this, it's alleged, some of these businessmen paid kickbacks, and that's what the case against Spiro Agnew is all about. While denying anything improper or illegal, Agnew's frank to say he knows the businessmen in question.
I had some people who were in the engineering business who were longtime friends and political supporters. I did not ever have any financial transactions with these people. I did consult with them. I did listen to their complaints. I did allow them access, as most political figures do, to persons who are supportive of their political campaigns.
At least 3 consulting engineers have told prosecutors of making payments to Agnew. Alan I. Green of Green Associates described how he delivered cash to Agnew as Maryland governor and later as vice president. There's a similar story from Lester Matz of the engineering firm of Matz Childs. And most importantly, there's testimony from a senior vice president of the J.E. Greiner Company, the biggest engineering firm of them all. He's Jerome Wolf, probably the key witness, who at one time had been Assistant Public Works Director for County Executive Agnew, later State Roads Commission Chairman for Governor Agnew, and until 3 years ago, Science and Technology Advisor on the staff of Vice President Agnew. Wolf is said to have collected funds for Agnew, and he supplied prosecutors with a diary that is said to describe in detail what happened and why. The engineering firms whose executives have talked did highly profitable business, sharing in multi-million-dollar government contracts for such projects as the complex of interstate highways in and about Baltimore, for the new Chesapeake Bay Bridge, for construction of government buildings. These contracts for engineering services were awarded by government agencies without competitive bidding. But Agnew, in his first defense, denied that he'd received payments and returned favors. And he argued that the stories of the engineering executives were suspect because the witnesses against him are bargaining for more lenient treatment from prosecutors.
The accusations that are being made, if they do come from people who are also under investigation, must be looked at as accusations that are coming from those who have found themselves in very deep trouble.
United States Attorney George Bell won't talk about his case or the tactics he's using, but it is known that he's arranged immunity for at least some witnesses, and that he permitted a local official to plead to reduce charges. It's also been learned that Bell, in some fashion, has convinced one other highly important witness to cooperate. He's land developer and mortgage banker I.H. Hammerman, who's long been one of Agnew's principal fundraisers. The central allegation in the case now is that Hammerman, along with Jerome Wolf and a third friend, banker J. Walter Jones, collected funds for Agnew from engineers and architects and others interested in government business. Of the three fundraisers, J. Walter Jones alone is not cooperating. J. Walter Jones and Spiro Agnew have long had a close business and personal relationship. The Greater Baltimore Industrial Park, put together by Jones 13 years ago and the source of his wealth, originally was made possible by a favorable vote of two local zoning officials, one of them Spiro Agnew. Later, Jones and Agnew were fellow stockholders and directors of the bank that Jones founded, and they then were to be partners in at least two real estate ventures. The Jones-Agnew business relationships were to lead to allegations of conflict of interest, but there's never been any evidence that Agnew profited from these business ventures. In more recent years, Jones, who's now a millionaire, has been one of Agnew's closest advisors, fundraisers, and personal friends. But up to now, because no formal charges have been made against Agnew and because grand jury proceedings are secret, there's no way really to know just how strong the government case really is. And for his part, Agnew has challenged public accusations that he was paid $1,000 a week in kickbacks.
I am denying them outright, and I'm labeling them, and I think a person in my position at a time like this might be permitted this departure from normal language as damned lies.
So far, the grand jury has voted only one major indictment, Dale Anderson, Agnew's successor as Baltimore County Executive, who's charged with extorting some $43,000 from 8 consulting firms doing business with the county. It was the investigation into Anderson's activities that led to allegations about Agnew. Robert Shackney, CBS News, Baltimore.
U.S. Attorney James Thompson had been brought in from Chicago to handle the Justice Department's defense against Agnew's charge of leaking information. Thompson said tonight that he had reviewed the evidence against the vice president and, quote, "The man is a crook, no question about that at all." Thompson said he was certain Agnew would have been convicted if brought to trial and would have received a long prison term. In the same courtroom where Agnew entered his plea, the Justice Department outlined the evidence of its case, the allegations against him. Fred Graham reports.
The case against Agnew was set out by the Justice Department in a detailed 40-page recitation of the evidence that would have been presented if there'd been a trial. It told of 3 separate alleged kickback schemes. Number 1, Agnew arranged for his friend Hammerman and his state roads director Wolf to solicit payments from engineer consultants who wanted state road building contracts. Hammerman obtained and split with Mr. Agnew and Wolf cash payments from 7 different contracting firms in return for state engineering contracts and from one financial institution in return for a lucrative arrangement with the state involving the financing of certain state bonds. Number 2, Allen Green's engineering company received a series of state contracts after he made regular cash payments to Agnew, totaling about $50,000 over the years. According to the Justice Department, the payments continued after Agnew became vice president. Payments were made 3 or 4 times a year and were personally delivered to Mr. Agnew by Green, either in the vice president's office in the executive office building in Washington or at his apartment in the Sheraton Park Hotel in Washington. Number 3, Matz, another engineering company official, allegedly began a similar arrangement with Agnew about a decade ago, and according to the Justice Department, Matz paid 5% of his fees from Baltimore County contracts in cash to Mr. Agnew through one of Mr. Agnew's close associates. These payments continued after Agnew became vice president. The Justice Department noted one instance when Matz met with Mr. Agnew in the vice president's office and gave him approximately $10,000 in cash in an envelope. A furious legal battle erupted over the charges, but by last Monday night, lawyers for Agnew and the Justice Department were spotted meeting in an Alexandria, Virginia motel where the trial judge, Walter Hoffman, was staying. Nobody would say if plea bargaining was underway, and so it came as a surprise today when the announcement was made that a bargain had been struck for Agnew to resign and accept a conviction for tax evasion. Hammerman, Wolf, Green, and Matz could still be sent to prison, but because they were prepared to testify against Agnew, the Justice Department will recommend leniency. All of them, including Agnew, could still be prosecuted under state law. One of the Maryland prosecutors who will have to decide whether or not to prosecute Agnew was reached tonight by CBS News, and he said, "My head's still spinning." He said he hadn't given any thought to prosecuting Spiro Agnew. Fred Graham, CBS News, Washington.
By the way, correspondent Graham has had a personal involvement in this case. He was one of the newsmen subpoenaed by Agnew's lawyers in their search for the source of news leaks about the case. Those subpoenas were dropped today. Attorney General Richardson and U.S. Attorney George Bell have scheduled a news conference in Washington tomorrow morning, and CBS News will cover it live beginning at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. Agnew's under probation now without supervision. This means he'll not have to go through the process of reporting to a probation officer from time to time. But since Agnew pleaded no contest to income tax evasion, he could lose certain rights. For example, he could be disbarred, banned from the practice of law, his profession. Agnew's conviction is not a crime normally considered involving moral turpitude. Although it's not absolutely clear, before detailed legal research is done, he won't lose his civil rights, like the right to vote. Could he run for office again? Well, under the circumstances, the Justice Department says that right now it just does not know. First Lady Pat Nixon telephoned Mrs. Agnew to express the first family's, quote, saddened feelings over the resignation. According to her news secretary, Mrs. Nixon told Mrs. Agnew what a great job she had done, and the two then reminisced about their years together in public life. Mrs. Agnew was with 3 of her children today. The 4th, Kim, was away at college in Massachusetts. Frank Sinatra, Agnew's friend and golfing pal, said it took great courage for the vice president to pursue the route he chose. Sinatra continued, quote, "I have every hope that in the months and years to come, his action will result in greater public understanding of his feelings and position as the man in the arena." The big question tonight, who will succeed Spiro Agnew as vice president? President Nixon, an hour after Agnew resigned, pledged to be open-minded in picking a nominee, said he would consult with national leaders. Some of the names being mentioned as possibilities are Republican House and Senate leaders Gerald Ford and Hugh Scott, former Secretary of State William Rogers, Attorney General Richardson, presidential aide Melvin Laird, Republican National Chairman George Bush, former Governor William Scranton of Pennsylvania, and Senator Howard Baker. But many of those men might run into trouble on Capitol Hill. Democrats already have let it be known that they might not approve of someone who might use the office as a stepping stone to the presidency in '76. That reasoning might also spell trouble for the 3 men most prominently mentioned as possible successors to Agnew, Governors Reagan and Rockefeller of California and New York, respectively, and former Texas Governor John Connally, a recent convert to the GOP. Here's what they had to say about Agnew's resignation.
The resignation of Vice President Agnew is the culmination of a tragedy, both for the country and for him personally. He's my friend.
Is that your statement, Governor?
Yes, sir.
Now, what about your own position in this, Governor? You've been mentioned prominently as a possible successor to Mr. Agnew. Would you be willing to accept such a position?
I have no speculations in this field at all. As you know, I've maintained a very simple position from the beginning, that the tradition of our country is that a man is innocent until proven guilty. And that, as I've said before, there's an old phrase in Latin America that nobody climbs the top over the dead bodies of his friend.
Do you expect to hear from the White House,
You never know in this world who you're going to hear from.
I am shocked and saddened. Ted Agnew was and is a friend of mine. I know none of the details about this case or what has taken place, and therefore I have no further comment to make, no questions that you could ask that I could answer about it. Just again, I think that As I say, I'm saddened, and I'm sure that most people in America are, by what has taken place.
Would you be available as a nominee if the president asked you?
I don't have any comment on anything further.
Well, I can get. Governor, what's there to say right now about that resignation?
Well, it obviously is a great personal tragedy, I think, for the vice president, and I think it's a sad day for the republic, very frankly. I don't think there's anything about it that should evoke any joy or happiness on the part of anybody. I just think it's a real sad day.
Have you talked to the president about this?
No, I have not. No, I have not.
If you were offered the vice presidency, would you take it, Mr.
I'm not going to speculate on that at all. I don't have any idea what he'll do, and so I'm not going to, at this point, speculate about what he might do or anything about it.
Do you have any idea, Governor, when we might hear a nominee and name?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think the country is going to be saddened by what happened today, as I think it properly should be. The president, I'm sure, will consult with a great many people, as is his custom under such circumstances, and then I think he'll move with as much dispatch as he feels possible. And I think that'll be in the interest of the country.
Another whose name has been tossed about as a vice presidential possibility is Senator Barry Goldwater, who ran unsuccessfully for president in 1964. But less than a month ago, Goldwater said if a replacement for Agnew ever was needed, he had his own personal choice, and it was not Barry Goldwater.
Senator, let's suggest that it comes to pass that Agnew does resign. Who do you like, Connolly or Rocky?
I like Reagan.
Are there any of the people mentioned, including Rockefeller, Connolly, and others, who would not be acceptable to you?
No, I can accept anybody that they're talking about. I think Mr. Connolly would be a very fine choice. Rockefeller is moving to the right so that he's much more acceptable than he was at one time, and he's very, very strong on foreign policy, which I think is the most important attribute of any man in those two offices.
But Reagan is your first choice.
He would be, but I don't think he's going to seek it. So that you're probably down, when you mentioned Connolly and Rockefeller, you're probably down to the two that would be there.
Would there be objections from Republican members of Congress to Mr. Connolly based on the fact that he's a brand spanking shiny new Republican?
I don't think so. You might get some of that reaction from state chairmen and national committeemen, but those of us in the really the nitty-gritty of Republican politics know that we're a minority party, and we welcome anybody just so they're alive and have blood running through them. And
given resentment in the Democratic camp, do you think there's any chance that Connolly would get in? You're reading as senator, your fellow members.
Oh, I think that he would. Oh, no, there'd be no opposition to Connolly.
Even from the Democratic camp, making a...
Oh, the Democratic camp, I don't know what nobody knows what they're going to do. They don't even know themselves.
Senate vacancy occur. Would you rule yourself out as filling the post of the vice presidency?
I would rule myself out. No one's talked to me about it. And I wouldn't look forward to it if... hello, James. No, Doc back there. No, your man's never going to say that. No man's going to say he'd rule himself out of being named vice president. Wouldn't want to run for it, but I'm getting to that age where it falls as the gentle rain from heaven.
The assassination of President Kennedy thrust Lyndon Johnson into the White House, but left the country without a vice president. That problem for this and future administrations was remedied 6 years ago by the 25th Amendment. It calls for the president to nominate a vice president who must be approved by a simple majority of the two houses of Congress. But procedural questions still remain. How long does the president have to select a nominee? Must the nomination first go to a congressional committee? David Henderson spoke with Harvard professor Paul Freund, an authority on constitutional history, about the problems of picking a successor to Agnew.
What is the precedence for a vice president resigning like this?
Well, there isn't any, in as much as the present situation is governed by the 25th Amendment, which has been in force only some 6 years. Previously, the office would simply remain vacant until the next election. And it was that prospect, that specter, after President Kennedy's assassination and the accession of Lyndon Johnson, leaving the office of Vice President vacant, that led to a strong movement for a constitutional provision that would take care of the situation.
What can the president do and what can't he do now in naming a replacement for Mr. Agnew?
Well, he nominates, and the two houses of Congress must confirm. The constitutional amendment of which I spoke, the 25th, speaks of confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. That looks a little ambiguous. It isn't clear whether it means the two houses sitting together or each house separately, but I think it's quite clear from the history of the amendment that it means the two houses separately. Each house, in other words, must confirm by a majority.
Is there any time limit at all? Is there a deadline?
No, there is no deadline. Again, one has to rely on good faith. I take it that given the seriousness of the occasion, this matter would have the right of way in Congress. That is to say, a nomination by the president would not be sidetracked or buried in committee, but would be given priority. That is only, however, a matter of their own procedure, and it isn't spelled out in the constitutional amendment.
How much control does Congress have over the naming of a successor to Mr. Agnew?
Well, of course, we've never had any experience with this particular procedure, so it's hard to say. I would guess, as a matter of political prudence, that there would be some advanced consultation in order that there would not be a head-on confrontation in the event of a nomination. In other words, that the advising and consenting, to use a phrase elsewhere in the Constitution, would be done preliminarily. But this is all informal.
It certainly will take a while to pick a successor to Agnew. And it's already clear that more time and thought will be given this decision than was given the original decision that there even should be a vice president, as John Hart reports.
The vice presidency wasn't much more than a random thought of the Founding Fathers. They'd been arguing for 4 months over the mainframe of the new government, worrying over whether the presidency should be something like a monarch or be plural, an executive council of some sort. We don't know exactly because they met in secret, but we think Alexander Hamilton of New York came up with the idea for a vice presidency. The tired convention debated the final scheme for only 1 day. As Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers, there was much opposition, some feeling the office was mischievous. Some wanted the Senate to elect the vice president out of their own body. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was against the vice president presiding over the Senate because he thought it blurred the separation of powers, saying, "We might as well put the president himself at the head of the legislature." Roger Sherman of Connecticut said, if the vice president were not president of the Senate, he would be without employment. Colonel George Mason of Virginia was against the office entirely. He wanted the Senate to appoint a privy council instead. And Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania observed that the vice president would be the first heir apparent that ever loved his father. The office was despised. The first vice president, John Adams, said, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Ben Franklin was against the office, saying, "If they insist on having one, I shall address him as Your Superfluous Excellency." In the end, they decided that the runner-up in the presidential elections would be the vice president and that he would preside over the Senate. By 1804, the two-party system was political tradition, and the 12th Amendment had vice president and president elected together. There have been vice presidents in trouble before. Aaron Burr served while under indictment for the murder of Alexander Hamilton. Schuyler Colfax was accused of taking bribes, and Andrew Johnson was drunk at his inauguration. But the vice presidency has served the Republic often. For 1/5 of our nation's life, we've been governed by men who were first elected as vice presidents.
As we've noted several times, when President Nixon makes his choice for vice president, the burden then shifts to Congress. And it's a situation the Senate and House have never before had to face. In our Washington newsroom tonight are Eric Severide and Roger Mudd, along with Dan Rather at the White House. And gentlemen, what happens when this responsibility now is passed to Congress?
Well, I think, Walter, that everybody is sort of making up what they're going to do. I haven't heard any precise scenario laid out by the members. As we've said all night, this is a brand new experience. Albert, the Speaker, is making no comment. Mansfield wants to meet again tomorrow. Mr. Scott says that he'll pick up some sealed envelopes tomorrow. You can put your top 3 choices in the envelope and lick the thing shut, and they'll deliver it to Rosemary Woods. But beyond that, this is a very difficult problem for the Congress. And the Democratic Party on the Capitol Hill is being dragged really directly into the Republican nominating procedure. If you take your average Democratic congressman and visualize his predicament, if the president sends up a nomination that is someone of the stature of John Connally or Ronald Reagan or Nelson Rockefeller, the Democratic congressman is being asked to vote for him in 1973, and 3 years later, when that man presumably has the Republican presidential nomination, he's got to attack him back home in Indiana or Iowa. Suppose he sends up a caretaker. Then that congressman is being asked to approve some throttle bottom or wintergreen who's not really fully qualified. He hopes that the president will send up somebody halfway in between.
Well, you're saying, Roger, that the Democratic majority in the Congress may select the next Republican president.
Well, they've got the balance of power.
But what about this caretaker idea? Because I noticed Senator Humphrey tonight suggesting it ought to be someone of that kind who will pledge not to run 3 years from now. But this cannot be legally binding. And it seems to me there's something inconsistent with what the Democrats are saying. They're saying that it should be, they're saying first that it must have a man of presidential caliber because it's 3 years to go and anything could happen to the president. On the other hand, he must not be a man who would run for president. Well, and so much would happen in the course of this time that it's
the litmus test today, as we've seen on the evening news and tonight on this special broadcast, is that those Democrats, most of those Democrats who have an interest in running themselves in 1976, want a caretaker. They don't want to be put in the position of helping the Republican Party nominate their opposition. Sure. It's a very difficult predicament.
Sure, but there's a lot of debate in the record, you know, on the 25th Amendment in the mid-60s. And I think that even Chairman Seller in House Judiciary and Senator Bayh on the Senate side made considerable point of the fact that this nomination, if it should come to the Congress, there should be no partisan political judgments made on it. It shouldn't be handled that way. And if you're to say it must be a caretaker that can't run against it and so on, that in a real negative but real sense is applying partisan standards to it. And that'll all be thrown back at them.
Well, it's one of those amendments that sounded, I guess, so logical at the time, and now when the reality is with us and all the problems that press in around us, and you hear the comments today and the logic of the caretaker versus the active candidate becomes so apparent that there are certain imperfections in that amendment. Listening to the comments tonight of John Connally and Nelson Rockefeller, you know that they're not about to come out and say really what they think.
No, of course not.
They want to lay low, keep a low profile. John Connally, I haven't heard any comments tonight from Elliot Richardson, for instance.
No, the 25th Amendment, which is now coming into play only 6 years after it was ratified, the real thrust of it originally was to deal with the problem of presidential disability, not with a vacancy in the vice presidency so much. That came along in the course of the argument, and now that part of it's what's coming into play now. I must say, Roger, something about the things that are going on now with the president calling in everybody and listening to everybody's suggestions and so on, it is, to me anyway, faintly reminiscent of 1964, when President Johnson had all kinds of people come to the White House just before the convention in Atlantic City, Senator Dodds and McCarthy and others, and created all this storm of speculation as though he hadn't made up his mind who he wanted for vice president. I was convinced days before it was going to be Humphrey, and I think Humphrey was convinced. Now, I would think myself that President Nixon knows pretty well who he wants and has known for some time, at least whom he prefers, because everything he has said about the Agnew case in the last few difficult weeks were just about all he could say, because there might have been a trial and a jury decision. And he had to say, you know, he's innocent till proved guilty. But he had seen all this evidence, these 40 pages, long ago. And he knew that this case was going to go against him.
I would assume, some of this calling in of national leaders is a masquerade. I don't want to...
Roger, I was going to ask Dan, rather, that very question. He's standing by at the White House. And I was going to ask you, Dan, do you think that the president has somebody firmly in mind?
Yes, and I agree that he's had someone, or perhaps several people, firmly in mind for some long while. Now, one should be careful to emphasize, I want to be that careful, that perhaps he had not finally decided upon someone. But to put it out straight, I think the president for some while has wanted John Connally to be the next vice president if Mr. Agnew was not going to be able to remain in office. If not Connally, Rockefeller, Reagan with an outside choice to Laird. If you're looking for a scratch sheet, that's the way I'd put it. The question, however, is, will the Congress approve? Now, part of the process now is to determine whether the Congress will, in fact, agree with Mr. Nixon that he shouldn't appoint a caretaker vice president. What Roger and Eric were saying before, all those comments apropos, and those are things that have gone through the president's mind. But it's being made very clear here tonight that the president does not want to appoint a so-called caretaker vice president. He wants to appoint someone who could be a viable candidate in 1976. The question is whether he can be reasonably certain that Congress will approve the nominee he sends up. Now, I must say that up to and including most of today, most of the presidential aides who would talk come down on the side of the judgment that Congress will approve any reasonable candidate the president sends up, whether that candidate figures to be a viable candidate in 76 or not. The president is, however, bending over backwards to give this impression that he hasn't made his mind made up, because, again, it can't be emphasized too strongly, I believe, how sensitive the president is to what he considers to be this unfair speculation that he set out to dump Vice President Agnew and has been planning the succession for a long while. They're very sensitive about that here, and they consider it unfair even to bring that up.
Dan, has it ever been determined why the president several weeks ago asked John Connally to cancel a foreign trip he had planned and to stand by in the United States?
It has never been confirmed why he did that. There are any number of Connally's friends. It's a self-serving thing for them to say, of course, and in his service to say it, but there are any number of Connally's friends who said at that time, listen, Agnew's going to go, and the president wants Connally to serve in his place.
Do you think, then, that the president thought the timetable for Agnew's resignation was going to call for that considerably earlier than this?
Yes, it's in the area of speculation, but you've asked, and I must say that all the evidence has pointed to the president believing for some while that it was no longer a question of if Vice President Agnew was going to have to leave. It was only a question of how soon.
Walter?
Yes, indeed.
Connally, I was with Connally a couple days ago in Dallas and Houston. He just flatly denies that he's had any conversation at all with Mr. Nixon about the presidency, the nomination in 76, or the vice presidency. And watching him campaign back and forth for the last couple of weeks, he makes two messages come across from Mr. Connally. One is that I'm not going to talk about Mr. Agnew's troubles. I know he's got troubles. I don't want to talk about his troubles. He's got bad troubles. And then he says that the Republican Party has got bad troubles because of Watergate. It's obvious John Connally's ambition comes through all these denials of office seeking. He says he has not talked to Mr. Nixon about either nomination.
I can note, Roger, that the same applies to Governor Rockefeller of New York. And as regards the presidential possibilities, while the governor right now is presumably in the throes of deciding whether to run for another term as a governor, a lot of the people around him are talking of presidency again.
You know, Roger, theoretically, the president could send up a list of names to the Congress and say, you pick. That idea was discussed during the debate on the 25th Amendment. Mr. Nixon, who was then a private citizen, opposed that. He thought it should be just one name, though he also thought at that time, as I recollect what some of the historians have been writing recently, that we should reconvene the Electoral College and not have the Congress do it. Now, what is the mechanism in the Congress? They've never faced this procedural problem before.
Well,
I suppose they could have a joint committee from the outset to save time, but they're not going to, are they?
No, I think it sounds as if the House Judiciary Committee will handle it on that side. Howard Cannon, the chairman of the Senate Rules Committee, already is claiming jurisdiction for his committee. It appears that it will be a standing committee of House and Senate to do it separately. And
you know, there's another little fallacy in the 25th Amendment, it seems to me, that the Speaker of the House of Representatives is the man who is in line to succeed the President. Now, the longer he can hold out and delay in the processes of the Congress, not that Carl Albert is likely to do this, but a man with greater ambition, and perhaps if you had a president who was a little bit older, a little more feeble perhaps, could delay the process, couldn't he?
Well, there's no timetable laid out, is there? And there's no timetable, as we pointed out tonight, that requires the president to send up his nomination within a week. I think the original proposal was 30 days.
Well, the American Bar Association, way back in those debates, suggested a 30-day deadline, but that was dismissed on the assumption that any responsible president...
You have to assume that, don't you?
Eric, could the president send up a list of names? Doesn't the 25th Amendment call for him to nominate somebody that the Congress will then approve?
Well, I've forgotten the exact wording. That was discussed, that's all I said, that when the amendment was up.
Walter and Eric, I wonder if perhaps Roger would be the one to do this. Does the Congress plan to investigate the president's nominee? One of the concerns being expressed by some middle-level White House people is that whoever the president sends up as a nominee has to be, to use their phrase, super clean. Now, you could assume that the president himself would do some investigating, but what would be the procedure for the Congress investigating his nominee?
Well, it's a good question, Dan, and it's an apprehension that's been expressed particularly by liberal Democratic senators, and several have said that they reluctantly would vote for a active Republican, knowing that it might help him get the nomination in '76. But the hearings would have to be very tough. And those hearings would consist of regular staff investigations. The Senate Finance Committee conducted an investigation of John Connally. The Judiciary Committee conducted one of judicial appointments. So there's no lack of staff up there. That would not be a problem. The hearings could drag out if the president chooses to insult the Congress with a nomination. I see no evidence of that.
Thank you very much, Eric, Roger, Dan in Washington. Well, in addition to his own personal and political losses, Agnew's bearing a family loss, the death yesterday of his half-brother, 67-year-old Ray Pollard. The former vice president went tonight to a funeral home in Randallstown, Maryland, to pay his respects, and he spoke briefly to reporters there as he was leaving, and we just received film of that.
Mr. Agnew, can you comment? Can you comment on the developments today, sir?
I'm going to have something to say in a few days, not tonight.
Can you give us an idea about how long a few days might be?
Probably 2 or 3 days.
What format will that be, sir?
Well, I haven't decided. I have to check it out.
This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
This has been a CBS News special report